simulator belonging to one of the plane's pilots. BBC News.
This is BBC Radio 4. Now, The Moral Maze, live with Michael Burke.
Good evening. Sex and drugs tonight, rock and roll next week. Actually, the arguments are deeper than just sex and drugs. Really at issue is what should be a crime, whether it has to have a victim, and how victimhood is defined. MPs are calling for the laws on prostitution to be changed, making the crime to be buying sex, not selling it. Implicit in this is the presumption that paying for sex amounts to violence against the prostitute. The other argument is over whether to legalise the use of cannabis. That campaign hinges on the idea that it cannot be a crime because it doesn't have a victim, and that the law creates problems rather than prevents them. Overshadowing both arguments is the unlikely figure of John Stuart Mill, a dry, stooped intellectual in a frock coat, bald as a doorknob, dead this century and a half. His philosophical assertion that the only reason power can rightly be exercised over anybody against his will is to prevent harm to others has proved one of the most persuasive ideas of our age. So, what constitutes a crime? Who's the victim? And where do we draw the line between disapproving and forbidding? That's our Moral Maze tonight. Our panel: Anne McElvoy, Public Policy Editor of The Economist, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Portillo, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, and the Anglican priest and controversialist Giles Fraser. Michael Portillo, are you Conservative with a small c on this, or are you a Libertarian instinctively?
More of a Libertarian. I think if you're going to criminalise something, it is important to establish that there's a victim, but of course, there are lots of harms that people suffer from things that aren't crimes and absolutely shouldn't be. But I think where two people consent to something, then there should certainly not be a crime there. And I find it very hard to explain why cannabis is illegal and whiskey is not. Anne McElvoy?
Well, I don't believe the idea of the victimless crime always means that there isn't a victim. I think it just means that the victim is not in the front line, or it's a bit harder to define who the victim is. And I think if we forget that, we lose the idea, the quite profound ethical idea in lawmaking, that it is also there to protect society and to protect people at large, as well as those right in front of you at any given moment.
Claire Fox.
Well, I'm not a moral relativist, and I'm really genuinely torn on this because I want to decriminalise prostitution and drugs, but I morally disapprove of both. So I'm slightly torn, but I think I'd go with the kind of Moses' Ten Commandments version, which is there are lots of things that you can morally set norms on, but I don't think you should use the law. And I want to encourage people to exercise their moral judgment more and hold each other to account and not rely on the state to do that for us.
Giles Fraser.
Well, when I think of drugs and prostitution, I think of misery, I think of desperation, I think of exploitation. I think it's terribly easy to have a sort of middle-class view of both, a Belle de Jour view of prostitution where it's sort of OK and there isn't a victim, and a sort of students puffing a joint and there isn't a victim there. But actually, I don't think that describes the reality.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Dr. Finn Mackay from the Centre for Gender and Violence Research at the University of Bristol. She's also founder of the London Feminist Network. She's on the line from Bristol now. Dr. Mackay, it's your case, I think, that the prostitute is always, by definition, the victim. She, or he for that matter, of course, has no moral agency at all?
I don't say that the people in prostitution have no agency, and I'm sure there are many out there who don't feel that they've been victimised, but prostitution is certainly not a victimless crime, not least for the many people in it who do face disproportionately high levels of rape and sexual violence and homicide, for example. And I also don't think it's victimless when you take into account the effect on society more broadly, and by that I mean I think that we're all failed by an institution that commodifies women for sale.
Michael Portillo.
Dr. Mackay, I think you just alluded to this in your answer. There are some women who don't feel as though they're victims when they're working as prostitutes. What do you say to them to convince them that they're victims of violence, as you put it?
I'm not trying to persuade them that they're victims of violence, and I hope that they're not. And if they've managed to get through that industry relatively unscathed, then good for them. But I don't think we should sell down the river the vast majority of women around the world for whom that is certainly not the case. I'm more interested in asking the question about why so many men assume that they have a birthright to buy and sell the bodies of women, young men and children.
So it's not your position that prostitution as such constitutes an act of violence against women by men?
I believe it can be classed as being on a continuum of gender-based violence, on a continuum of male violence against women, because I believe it is a symptom of a patriarchal and unequal society, and it follows the fractures of inequality in society along the lines of sex, but also class and race.
But what's your moral justification for wanting to criminalise something where two people perform an act consensually?
This is not a moral stance. You know, my stance is a political stance, as I said, because I believe society is affected by an institution where women are objectified. I think that's dangerous for all of us.
This being the moral maze, could you help us, though, by expressing it in moral terms? What's your moral basis for interfering in consensual activity?
Well, I think we should trouble this notion of consent and choice in a society that is scarred by the masculinisation of power and wealth, for example, where people find themselves in a context of very, very limited options. And I also think that choice doesn't make everything unquestionable. It doesn't mean that we can't investigate the effects that that choice has and the effects that the existence of the industry itself has on society.
And when you refer to the industry, how far does that go? Lap dancing, for example, pole dancing. Would you wish to criminalise those? Or, sorry, would you wish to criminalise men who went to watch them?
I would like to see lap dancing clubs banned. I don't welcome their move into the high street. I don't welcome their mainstreaming in society. I don't want to walk down this high street and see women for sale, commodified as goods. I believe if you objectify women, we shouldn't be surprised when women are treated as objects.
What about
in their
women
homes
who
and on the
objectify
streets?
themselves, by dressing in a way that makes them very sexually attractive to men, plunging dresses, tiny shorts, What about that?
Well, I have a mantra that I'm not going to blame women for playing the game when they never wrote the rules. We live in a society increasingly influenced by the pornography industry. Women are told quite clearly that the most important thing they can do is be sexually attractive and desirable to the opposite sex. They're told how they have to do that, and then they're blamed when they do it.
And you really think that in society, 50% of society, let's say men, wrote the rules, and that women have nothing to do with the rules?
That's the history of patriarchy, yes.
Claire Fox?
If I could take a step back from prostitution, can I ask you, do you have any concerns when the law becomes a kind of vehicle for setting moral norms?
Well, I think that laws can do two things. They can represent where society is at already, or they can draw society up with them. And in this case, I think the law should be sending a message. It should be sending a message that women are not for sale. It should be sending a message about what we consider ethical, moral and just, and what we don't.
I understand that you have a set of messages you want to send, but I'm talking about how you have an argument about those messages. So I'm talking about if the state starts banning things that people don't like for whatever reasons politically, can't we end up in a situation whereby anything that somebody finds morally repugnant, infidelity, for example, could just be against the law?
Well, we've banned and censored many things. We ban child sex abuse images, for example. We have hate crime legislation around religious and racial hatred. And I think that we need to take the same stand for women.
But we've also banned homosexuality historically, and that many countries still do use the law for that reason. There's ambivalence now about perfectly consensual sadomasochistic practices that some people find utterly morally repugnant and then use the law to close down. I'm asking you, don't you have nervousness about that kind of moral boundary setting?
It is right to have nervousness and cautiousness around giving more power to a state that is inherently capitalist and patriarchal. But we have an opportunity here to use the law for good, not to maintain the status quo, like the laws around homosexuality that you're talking about, but using the law to challenge and change the status quo. And that's what I'm interested in doing.
But that is an irony, isn't it? That you are, on the one hand, saying that by its very nature, women are absolutely victims of whether they like it or not, as you say, written by men, rules written by men. But you're perfectly happy to use the male state to actually, in the most authoritarian, dangerous police state way, to ban anything you particularly don't like because you think it might help women. I mean, might you not be the person who is actually following the dictates of the patriarchal state.
I live in the real world, and until the revolution, I want the law to make positive changes for women. I don't want women to be commodified as goods for sale.
So that's an
a
interesting
basic
point.
101.
So that's an interesting point. You want the law to make, to free women, but does that not undermine the sense of women taking control of their own lives? In fact, the whole way you describe women is as though they're determined by these objective forces. That destroys women's moral autonomy. The very thing which we're fighting for, isn't it?
It's not feminists that have victimised women or turned women into victims. It is those people that choose to buy and sell women, that choose to rape and harm women, that turn women into victims. I would prefer the term resistors. We are all patriarchy resistors, and we have to negotiate our way through a sexist society every day.
Dr. Mackay, thanks very much indeed for joining us tonight. Our second witness is Ian Driver, who's a Green Party councillor for Thanet District Council, who was reported this week to be looking for venues in Margate to open one of these cannabis cafes, like Amsterdam. You like cannabis, in fact, I understand all drugs to be made legal.
My personal view is that all drugs should be legalised. I'm not aware of a single society, ancient or modern, which has not had a culture of getting stoned, pissed up, drunk. So why choose some substances and say that they're legal and can be used, and others that can't? Let's stop fighting history, go with the flow, and legalise and regulate.
Giles Fraser.
Margate's got one of the largest drug abuse problems in the country. It's got one of the biggest problems with violent crime in the country. It's got one of the biggest problems with domestic violence in the country. Don't you think these are linked?
I don't think they are. I think it's so easy to start throwing out nonsense about what the situation is. There is lots of victimless crime, and I think by having drug use, cannabis cafe in Thanet, in Margate, or anywhere else in the country, it will by definition be an excellent and a very good thing. It will improve health, it will improve the economics of the area, it will reduce crime, and I think it'll have many more benefits than scaremongers such as yourselves.
Well, I'm not scaremonger. I mean, I've got these figures from the Thanet Gazette. Okay, so
indeed, I read it regularly.
I'm sure you do, and there is clearly a real problem with drugs and with things like domestic violence. And when people get, there seems to me an obvious point to be made here, a question to ask: when people get high on drugs, when people get drunk. Some people go home and beat up their wives, some people go and commit crime, and you seem to be terribly blasé about all of that.
I'm not blasé about it. I'm a councillor in that area, and it is a worry. But let's be real about this. The drug that causes the most damage is not cannabis, it's alcohol. The abuse of alcohol is the drug. Is what's causing violence, domestic violence, criminality, not smoking cannabis. And survey after survey has shown that.
But other drugs as well. You're not just talking about cannabis, you're talking about legalising all drugs here.
Absolutely,
You're
yes.
talking about all sorts of drugs, and all the ones that have yet to be invented, that get you high as a kite, that people can go out, and all sorts of things they do on these drugs. It's not just students having a joint at home. You're making it sound terribly sort of safe and so forth. People do extraordinarily violent things.
It's not safe. I didn't say that, so don't put words in
It's
my
not
mouth.
safe. Okay.
All drugs have got some risk. Alcohol probably has got more risk than others. But what I'm talking about is not a free-for-all. I'm talking about a regulated system where, just like alcohol, just like tobacco, you will be dictated as to where you can buy the stuff, where you can use it, the circumstances under which you use it. So it's not going to be a free-for-all.
I bet the tobacco companies just love you then, don't they? Because, you're legalising this sort of stuff. Don't you feel as a Green Party member a bit worried that you might be a useful idiot to international tobacco companies who are going to make a lot of money out of this.
I've been called some things in my time, but useful idiot.
Well, that was the phrase that Lenin... What I'm saying is that
I wouldn't.
The tobacco companies are going to love this.
No, actually, that's not necessarily the case. Look at Spain. You've got cannabis collectives going on all over Spain. They grow their own product, they sell it, they share it between themselves, and the tobacco companies are cut out. So it's
But it's a bit naive. It's going to be that scale. I mean, that's your sort of green fantasy, but actually, it's going to be
not a fantasy. It's a reality.
It's going to be made something big, and there's money to be made out of it.
There will be money to be made out of it, and a lot of taxation, which could be used for health, education, social services, and housing. So I think you need to chill out a little bit and maybe help yourself and have a spliff and calm down.
Anne McElvoy.
If such a thing were thinkable at the BBC. Mr.
Sorry.
Driver, you talked about risks and that you did accept that there were risks in drug
Of course,
use.
there are,
You
yes.
did. Would that not then lead you to think that perhaps some drugs, particularly those which are the use of which is life-threatening, therefore should be under more strictures than perhaps your cannabis?
Yes.
So you do accept the idea of stricture?
Within a system of regulation, some things are going to be easier to get than others. And also as well, just looking at the health risk, if you've got the prohibition system, then drugs that are available on the black market tend to be adulterated. You don't know what's in them.
Yeah, but hang on. So you actually do want to restrict the supply of hard drugs?
Let's start with some practical talk about restriction. I would not have a place selling cannabis to people under 18.
Right, but you don't then think, if you have a place where cannabis is more freely available, for many teenagers, just getting hold of it, finding the place, it is the deterrent, is the barrier to entry. In your nice smoky cafe, there will be lots of this stuff about, you don't think it's possible that people under 18 might just find someone to get it for them?
I'm sure they will, like they do with alcohol, but we'll try our best to regulate it. There's no such thing as a perfectly regulated system. Kids of 12, 13 are smoking tobacco. I see them every day. Kids are getting people to go in the off-licence, but we would regulate, there would be laws to try to prevent that happening, and we would be using it as
So it comes down to the laws and to regulation. You're not a libertarian, then?
No, I think you can be a libertarian with regulation. The two can go in hand.
It makes you a rather confused libertarian if you embrace regulation, but that's...
Well, I've been a confused liberation and a fool for the Green Party. That's I'm doing well tonight.
You're doing it your own way on the Isle of Thanet.
It's called Planet Thanet.
I can see why. Let me just turn... I do very regularly. Let me turn, though, to something rather serious, and that is the impact of cocaine, and particularly the production of cocaine,
Absolutely,
the deadly criminality.
Yes.
Just let me finish the point. I'm sure I can feel you dying to say something. That is the deadly consequences of that. Now, is that not a case? And I know that people who have taken cocaine, have been drug users, have then reconsidered the more they learned about the supply chain, the deaths of, including children and basically completely vulnerable people.
And this is one of the most serious issues when we talk about the legalisation of drugs, because the gangsterism, the criminality, the awful things that happen, especially in the producer countries, are a direct consequence of prohibition. If we had, well, not only, but largely, that's why the gangsters are there, because there's money to be made, because it's prohibited. So if there was an international legalisation, then some of cocaine, of marijuana, I think these awful warlike situations that we see with the cartels and so on, and the corruption in many of these countries at a political level, is a direct consequence of prohibition.
Ian Driver, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Our next witness is Cathy Gingell, who's editor of the website The Conservative Woman. As I understand it, Cathy Gingell, you want illegal drugs to stay illegal. You think there's a harm, you think there's a victim, and the state should prevent you harming yourself for your sake, and the states. That's basically your position, as I understand it. What about prostitution? Do similar principles apply?
Prostitution is slightly more confused in the sense that at the moment it is actually legal, as I understand it. It's only the pimping and the running of a brothel that's illegal. So I'm finding this comparison between prostitution and drugs slightly difficult, and especially the rights issue, where we seem to have prostitutes at war with each other over what they perceive to be their respective rights or victimhood status. So I think it's a huge muddle, and I think it actually shows where we get to a rights culture dead end, insofar as we have the government now trying to arbitrate between different sets of rights or concepts of women. Some women, sex workers, if they call themselves sex workers, believe in their absolute right to run their trade and sell their bodies. We have other women, the new gender women army, who believe that women are inevitably victims.
I take your point. Claire Fox.
I'm going to try and take a step back from both. Just philosophically, could you indicate where you are in relation to J.S. Mill on liberty, who, the classic thing which I obviously support is that you shouldn't intervene. If people want to harm themselves, they should be free to do so. How do you view that view?
I think theoretically it only works theoretically and it never works practically. I think the idea is that you are a sort of free agent, and whatever action you do does not impinge on anyone else. I would argue that might be fine if we lived in a society that was amoral and that actually allowed people to realise the consequences of their actions. The fact is, actually, for generations, and increasingly now so, we do not live in a society that allows people to suffer the consequences of their actions, whether it's from diet, from drink, from drugs.
But just to help me, because the premise of this discussion, in a way, is the relationship and the tension between morality and law. So, for example, recently we've been told that sugar is toxic, and therefore, you wouldn't be advocating a law to ban people from taking sugar themselves or putting sugar in their kids' tea or something. I mean, how do we, what harms should the law intervene in? I'm not talking about as a kind of moral decision maker.
Yes, I can see there are distinctions between substances as really what you're talking about. But I think the John Stuart Mill principle absolutely depends, the libertarian argument depends on the fact that you let people take the consequence of their action. You let the drug addict die in the street, and you walk by on the other side of the road. And on another fact that you only ever do harm to yourself. In practical life, you never only do harm to yourself.
Let's take that first premise, because I maybe I could challenge that a little. I mean, why is it that if something is legal or not criminalised, that it means that you walk on by? I mean, I would appreciate, if somebody's drinking too much in society, you would intervene and say, look, you shouldn't drink too much, it's harmful. Or if they were behaving immorally, you might, in other words, you can be judgmental and intervene. Why do you need the law to do that?
You've missed my point. What I'm saying is, the theoretical Mill position would only work if you let people live through the consequence or not live through the consequences of their actions. But we don't. Whether or not you simply have a set of moral sanctions or a law. On that point, I would say once you remove the law, what you are saying is society can't begin to enforce a moral code.
No, but I'm asking you, why would it not be better for us if we as individuals asserted that moral code, holding each other to account, instead of hiding behind the law? In fact, that makes us actually morally cowardly. We just say, let them law sort it out, instead of actually us doing as you want, which is to intervene.
It's very idealistic, Claire. I think it's unlikely. People don't. Once the law goes, the behaviour will slip too, and the social sanctions will slip too, especially in the case of drugs.
Michael Butler?
But just picking up Claire's point, historically speaking, it's quite recent, isn't it, that we've been relying on laws in the way that we do. Weren't people encouraged to be virtuous over very long periods of time because there were moral codes, some of them derived from religion, some of them from other sources?
Yes, I think that's true, and I think we have a huge problem now because we have a sort of myth of secular neutrality, but it is a myth. Religious beliefs and principles are sneered at. Christianity is the love that dare not speak its name. So we have great difficulty in a society to now depend on the role of just values, norms, mores, beliefs, principles, controlling people's behaviour.
I know that people don't go to church as much as they used to, but do you really think that people are kind of less concerned for one another than they used to be? Less concerned about regulating their own behaviour than they used to be?
Well, I think what we have is a highly individualistic culture in the way that we didn't have before. The sort of society you're talking about is very survival, depended on interdependence of families rather than dependence on the state, for example. So we've had a massive shift. Individualism has become the overarching sort of principle. Freedom has become the overarching principle. The result is an awful lot more state intervention. And that would be my final case, actually, against the arguments that were put before me and I think will be put after me for keeping drugs legal. Illegal, I beg your pardon. Keeping the status quo.
Yes,
we're in no doubt of where your position was, don't worry.
Let me understand where your, as it were, moral or ethical resting place is. How exactly can you explain that cannabis should be illegal and that whiskey should not be?
Oh, very easily. I think what you're talking about is one thing to keep a ban on something that is not customary, that is used, a behaviour engaged in by the population. Only a minority, 6%, took a drug last year of the adult population. And a habit that has been there for 1,000 years that is engaged in by 9/10 of the population. This is purely pragmatic. We cannot.
But that's my point. So it's purely pragmatic. Well, because I think there is a problem if you're going to make laws and you can't explain the moral basis of the law. You can't explain the moral basis of banning some things and not other things. I think that's a problem, but you don't.
I think there is a moral basis. I just think having something that's been in society for 1,000 years, used by 9/10 of the population, is very different. But I think if you look at the damage caused by a drug like cannabis, I don't know a child who's gone psychotic on alcohol. I personally know several children who have
You must know of terrible harms that have come from alcohol.
I know of worse harms that have happened to children from cannabis. It's an underestimated, not a soft drug. So I have no ethical problem in wanting to stop my children or any other children from being more exposed to that drug.
Cathy Gintrom, thank you very much indeed. Our last witness is Dr. Sean Gabb, who's director of the Libertarian Alliance, writer, broadcaster and academic. What do these issues tell you about liberty and licence? Is libertarianism triumphant, do you think, or is John Stuart Mill revolving in his grave?
Is libertarianism triumphant? No, it isn't. If you look at a very small front on gay issues, there has been a very welcome lifting of legal restrictions over the past quarter of a century.
But more broadly?
But I'm afraid the gay liberalisation has not been due to libertarianism running rampant. It's been due to the activities of a very effective interest group. If you look to the rights of shooters, of smokers, of DIY enthusiasts, or of anyone trying to run a business, you can see that the country has become far more authoritarian and indeed oppressive over the past 25 years.
Anne McElwin?
What is essentially wrong to your mind with paternalist authoritarianism within bounds? What's so bad about the idea that we look out for each other a bit?
Well, I would stand with John Stuart Mill's central point, which is that over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Now, we've been talking about victimless crimes. I do not regard an act as a crime unless there is an identifiable victim. All you have in the absence of a victim is a pseudo-crime, or to be more blunt, you have an unjust command.
Are you sure that you always know who your victim are? When you said identifiable, I mean, it would rule out all sorts of protections, wouldn't it, we put in place? I mean, everything from seatbelts in cars to laws against animal cruelty, where it's a bit hard within the normal framework of rights to call the animal the victim, but we just think it's not the right thing for society to do, to simply allow these things. Is there no sense to your mind that might be a good moral instinct?
Let us leave aside the question of cruelty to animals, where there may well be an identifiable victim, but things like seatbelt laws, no, there should be no seatbelt laws. There should be no command to wear crash helmets if you ride a bicycle.
Now, I want to get to the point here. Our time is short. Is that because essentially that contravenes your philosophy, or just because you don't think it works, or you think a different approach to light approach to lawmaking would be more effective? Which is it? Is it the philosophy or is it the practice?
Oh, it's all of them. Look, leave aside the philosophy. The moment you call for power to be given to the state to regulate something, you are calling for power to be given into the hands of people you do not know, who are not accountable to you, who may not share your values, and who will probably use that power in ways that you find shocking.
And you never find that something that they protect you against might be worse. You would never find, for instance, that the use of hard drugs might be worse than somebody trying to stop you by law from doing so.
I certainly believe that aggressions should be punished, and perhaps the laws against aggression should be more vigorously policed than they are at the moment. But acts which may or may not be preparatory to aggressions, no, there should be no laws against those. If you go home and beat your wife up, you should be put in prison. But if you drink a couple of bottles of whiskey, that is a matter for you.
And there would be no limit to that. There's no class of drug, there's no act of violence, if colluded in, which society should say, no, we think this is...
What do you mean by acts of violence colluded in?
Extreme sadomasochism, for instance, where real harm and threat to life occurs.
Oh, so long as there's consent, of course there should be no laws against it. None whatever.
Even if a life is threatened.
As long as there is valid consent, no, of course no laws.
Giles Fraser?
I just want to ask a couple of questions about the limits of, where you think the state should get involved. I mean, you said something about seatbelts. What about drink driving legislation? Do you think we should have the drink driving legislation that we have?
No, I don't. In the first place, people should be punished as and when they commit an aggression, but not for acts which may or may not be preparatory.
So someone who's going to go into it, someone goes into a car, gets in a car, and is absolutely completely off their head. You think that shouldn't be a crime for someone to drive a car off their head?
If he's driving without due care and attention, that is a crime in itself.
But I mean, would you not be anxious if you took away drink driving legislation that actually there will be thousands of dead bodies on the streets of people just like who are drunk, mowing them down? Well, you'd have that on your conscience.
OK, what you're doing is you're expressing very clearly one of the differences between a libertarian and an authoritarian. You seem to believe that unless people are hemmed in at every point by criminal laws, they will behave in a most beastly manner, whereas I believe that most people do not behave in a beastly manner.
Let's just do one other example, because I'm quite shocked by that. There's been quite a lot of stuff about paedophilia and paedophilia information exchange recently and so forth. Do you think the state should have a view about adults having sex with children?
Well, yes, because there you have the question of when does somebody become a consenting adult, and it's quite obvious that there is an age below which someone cannot give valid consent. But you see, I don't regard that as a valid point to make against libertarianism.
I'm just asking the question.
I've said that consenting adults should be free to do whatever they find convenient.
But the state should butt out as much as it can.
Yes.
Why don't you go away and live in Somalia?
Pardon?
Why don't you go away and live in Somalia?
No.
There's a failed state. There's no state going on in Somalia. We'd love it there, would you?
Again, you're making the usual authoritarian misconception that without all of these laws to hem us in, there will be anarchy, there will be chaos.
Well, there is anarchy and chaos in Somalia.
There may be anarchy, but there's also chaos, whereas a society with fewer laws than we have may not be at all chaotic. Look, the present authoritarian state under which we live is a very recent construct. It began to grow seriously only 100 years ago. England before 1914 was not a notably chaotic place, yet until 1914, until 1920, you could wander into a gun shop without producing any identification. You could buy as many guns as you liked. You could wander into a pharmacy. You could buy heroin. You could buy cannabis. You could buy cocaine. Yet, in the absence of all the authoritarian laws under which we now live, England was not, so far as I can tell, a notably chaotic place before 1914.
Dr. Gabb, thank you very much indeed. Panel, such a lot to go for tonight from all these witnesses. Let's start at the beginning with Dr. Mackay. Two things particularly interested me. I don't know whether you share the same idea. I think it was you, Michael, who put it to her that there are women who objectify themselves, who deploy their sexual attractiveness for one reason or another, not just prostitutes. And she came up with a line that her mantra was that she wouldn't blame women for playing the game when they didn't write the rules.
Yes. And then, of course, she went further, because when I said to her, well, are you really saying that 50% of the population play no part at all in making the rules? She said that was absolutely right. We live in a patriarchy. We are patriarchal and capitalist, and these seem to be very, very, very big problems for her. But certainly,
no. But surely the real point is that she doesn't think in this particular case, or any case, that women have any moral agency at all in this context. Is that?
So it appeared, and of course the proposition that is being considered by Parliament is that in this transaction only one party would be criminalised. The men would be criminalised and the women would not. And that proposal is grounded, I think, on thinking which is quite similar to Dr. Mackay's.
Well, I think she was very convincing. I have to say, I think she was very convincing. Men have traditionally written the rules, and that's what's going on here. And I thought, Michael, I thought you were a bit close to the edge when you were talking about, women dressing provocatively. I mean, I know it's dangerous to say that then you can somehow that's the women's fault for doing it. I mean,
I was simply trying to find out what Dr. Mackay objected to. I mean, she objected to lap dancing. She wanted the lap dancing clubs to be banned. So I wanted to know how she felt about women who decided to objectify themselves, and her explanation was that they were victims.
The point is, Giles, that you yourself have made the point at the beginning of the programme, which I actually was interested in, share a distaste for the pornification of society that our first witness expressed. I don't like that stuff, right? But you yourself made the point that, Belle de jour or whatever it is, that whole kind of like prostitution chic, people going on the radio going, well, look, I'm just a sex worker, what's the difference between that and getting married? I mean...
That's rubbish.
Yeah, I know. But the interesting thing is that therefore I think that we have a cultural problem that underestimates the degradation of prostitution, but I don't think we can just say, and that's men's fault. I think that we can say we've got a cultural problem, and I feared that my first witness, whether she wanted to or not, does undermine moral agency by turning women into victims.
Anne McElvoy, that I thought was interesting, was that she wanted the law to do two things. I never found out what the second one was, but the one she concentrated on was the law to send a message about what was ethical and what was just. What did you make of that? I
think that the difficulty with sending a message is that is the message according to her, and I think she had some perfectly reasonable things to say about commodification of sexuality and mainstreaming, and I thought she made the point rather well actually about lap dancing and the way that these things just sort of permeate society, and at what point do you say no? But I think really they all talking about what civil society should be doing. If you don't want lap dancing in your high street, then do something about it. Go and talk to your local council about it. Protest outside it. But I think this attempt, I think she was just heavy-handed really about only wanting the laws on prostitution to apply to men and the removal of moral agency from women. I think that's rather anti-feminist, and I think a lot of women would feel that they were being treated as rather weak-minded by that.
Second witness, Ian Driver, who was very good fun.
He was brilliant, wasn't he?
It was, yes. Calm down, Giles. Have a spliff. A libertarian with regulation. But didn't he have a point about that when you took him... his point was that prohibition created problems rather than solved them. And I suppose he didn't reference the prohibition of alcohol in the United States, and Al Capone, all this kind of stuff, but he might easily have done, Charles. Where do you stand on that?
Look, clearly creates a problem, prohibition does. I understand that, and that's right. But he refused to acknowledge the fact that if you legalise and you turn it into an international multi-million-pound industry, you create other sorts of problems as well, massive problems, all the way down the supply chain, from the people who are exploited making coke in South America, all the way through to the people who get beaten up because their husbands use it.
I mean, I definitely don't want to go down the kind of hippie, let's all kind of go down to the cannabis calf route. I have actually got serious problems with encouraging drug use or actually saying that there's no consequence for it. It's just that I think that people are to be treated as adults, to take risks with any substances and to live their lives according without the state regulating. Now you can see this mess the state's got into on this one. Nobody can even decide whether what's harmful, what's not harmful. You always get the hypocrisy argument about alcohol comes up every time. So I think free us of this burden. make drugs legal, and that does not mean you morally approve of them or that you actually encourage people to take them. A completely different question.
The last two witnesses are fresher in our minds because they're more recently, but there was a direct contradiction there between Kathy Gingell, who said, once the law goes, behaviour will slip, rather ringingly, and then Dr. Gabb, who said, that the mistake was thinking that if people weren't hemmed in by criminal laws, they behave in a beastly fashion.
Yeah. I thought,
Michael.
Well, I thought Dr. Gabb was very refreshing in making those points. What he said about, as it were, England before 1914 not being chaotic, that in England you were able to buy cocaine and heroin. I have to take his word for it. I didn't know that. Yeah. I mean, those were very, very striking points. And I think, certainly I think with Kathy Gingell, there was that assumption that if the law didn't do things, that was kind of the end of it. And indeed, she said that as we become a more individualist society, I think this was her implication, that we're going to need more and more laws because we've become so individualistic. I thought this was all, rather depressing and really didn't leave much room for moral agency at all.
I was a bit worried that both of them had a moral nostalgia, led them in very different directions. But I think so that's always something to be very wary of in these debates, that you had in Kathy Gingell's sense an idea that it's slightly dystopian, everything will go to hell in a handcart unless you pass more and more laws. Well, to me that seems a very dubious way to pursue a moral agenda. But then I thought she was, as you said, Michael, very refreshing witness, very convincing really about a sort of core idea of the free agency. But this is not the case that you can compare a drugs policy in the 19th century. Look at the difference. There is not the availability in the slums of the 19th century is not the case of the availability on the council estate.
The real question here is how do libertarians propose to protect the weak against the strong? And that's one of the most important things that laws are there for. And the idea that you just take all these laws down, the truth is there isn't a convincing account of how the weak are going to be protected. And it's just his very naive view of human nature that we're all good people and it's all fine.
It was very sad, and maybe it would be of some concern for you, Giles, to notice that with Kathy Gingell, that what she was saying was, I'm a Christian, I have moral norms, but they're on decline, and so therefore I've got to use the law. Now, what I think is that is an absolute abdication of responsibility by those people who believe in moral norms, that they don't go and fight for them and hide behind the law. We've now banned spitting of footballers, by the way. That's how bad the law is. It's authoritarian. Certainly not.
Yeah, briefly, because we're running out of time, the other central thing was the idea of the victimless crime, because those on the other side of the argument said there's never, it isn't victimless.
There's lots of non-crimes that have victims too. I don't think everything should be. There's lots of things that you will do in everyday life that will make someone suffer. Not you personally, Michael, but in general.
Thank you.
And I use the example of infidelity, but I just said, if you have an affair, somebody's going to get hurt. Lots of victims there, children. I do not think we should make it against the law to have an affair, even though I might morally disapprove of being able to.
Not being able to name the victim does not mean that there is not real harm and that it is within bounds reasonable for the law to address that, and that's also a moral purpose of law.
That being the case, we better get on with making whiskey illegal.
That, dear listener, is where the programme ends, but believe me, the discussion won't. That's it for this week from our panel, Claire Fox, Anne McElvoy, Michael Portillo and Giles Fraser, and from me. Until the same time next week, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was chaired by Michael Burke. The producer was Phil Peagam. During Lent, the period of the traditional fast that leads up to Easter, at this time each week we're broadcasting a series of talks. This year the theme for the Lent talks is power. This week the writer Catherine Fox wants to talk about the inversion of power.
As a novelist, I find it really annoying when other people tell me how to write. If it's a copy editor, I try to rein in my annoyance and address the list of queries I've been sent about my latest manuscript. I try not to think, write your own book if you're so clever. One thing I'm not prepared to tolerate, though, is Word's grammar check with its impertinent squiggly green underlining of my prose. Fragment. Consider revising. I know it's a fragment. I did it on purpose, for effect, because I'm a writer. Besides fragments, one of the things grammar check sets its pedantic face against is the use of passive verb forms.